Hello and welcome to another GCSE Geography video tutorial. This one covers Paper 1 Topic 3, Ecosystems, Biodiversity and Management. So here are the advice and disclaimers for you to read, and we'll get straight into it. So this topic begins looking at world ecosystems, or better known as biomes, and more specifically we're looking at where they're found, which you can see on the world map here, but their characteristics. So what we mean by characteristics is their climate, so the amount of temperature and precipitation you might expect to see there, vegetation, how much and what type of vegetation you would find there, and the soil type, whether it's very fertile or infertile. So we'll start off looking at savannas or tropical grasslands. They tend to be hot all year round, 25 to 35 degrees Celsius, and they have wet and dry seasons. So in the wet season you can expect 500 to 1,000 millimetres of precipitation. Most of the vegetation you find here tend to be grasses, so that's why they're called the tropical grasslands. They're tall grasses, some drought-resistant shrubs and trees like the baobab tree. Think the Lion King climate and vegetation. The soil itself is not very fertile. Most of the nutrients are found near the surface. So the next biome is the boreal forest, or the taiga, and this is where you'd find quite warm summers between 16 and 30 degrees Celsius, but the winters are incredibly cold with sort of very frozen soil there. They don't have much in the way of precipitation, mainly in the summer, and it tends to be less than 500 millimetres. In terms of the vegetation you'd find there, it's largely coniferous trees, so think Christmas trees. They've got needles rather than leaves, and that means that the less water they've got, it doesn't matter quite so much because they're not losing so much of it. The soils themselves are quite acidic, low in nitrogen, and they do not have many nutrients. So the next is the grasslands, or the temperate grasslands, and they have hot summers, a bit like the boreal forests, of 25 degrees or so, but the winters are incredibly cold, -8 degrees on average. 500 to 900 millimetres of rainfall over the course of a year, but most of it is in late spring and summer. Again, like the savanna, it's largely grassland. Very few trees and shrubs grow there, and the soils, unlike the savanna, are quite fertile. So the next one is the tropical rainforests. Now we're going to go into these in more depth later on in this topic. So tropical rainforests have the most consistent and best conditions for plant life, and hence why there's so much plant life and wildlife that actually lives there. So they are hot all year, 27 to 30 degrees Celsius, and they're wet all year as well. The average rainfall is between 2 and 3,000 millimetres. They are the largest variety of plant life and animal life on Earth. They are broadleaf, evergreen plants, mainly trees, and like I say, lots of wildlife that associates with those habitats. The soils, quite surprisingly, are thin and acidic and largely infertile, but that's mainly because most of the nutrients are actually locked up in the plant life that exists there. So the next one is the deserts. Now these are very hot all year round, very similar to the tropical rainforests, largely above 30 degrees Celsius. They do get incredibly cold at night though, because there's no cloud cover. The rainfall is very, very low, and less than 250 millimetres a year. Now because of that lack of rainfall, it does mean that most plants that you get there, and there's not many of them, are what we call xerophytes, and they're plants that can rely on very little moisture. They tend to have things like spines to conserve their water and reduce transpiration, very much like the conifer trees over here, and they've got large root systems, and like I say, low production means there's just not many of them there. The soils themselves essentially are sand, so they're very infertile, they lack nutrients, and not much organic material goes into them. The next ones are the ones that we'll be familiar with, and again, like the rainforest, we'll go into more detail for these. These are the temperate forests, or the deciduous forests. So these are the ones we associate with the United Kingdom. We tend to have warmer summers, up to 18 degrees, and cooler winters of maybe 5 degrees Celsius, and we do get year-round precipitation, around 1,000 millimetres in total on average. The trees we'd find there are deciduous trees, so they'll drop their leaves in winter when there's less moisture available because it's frozen, and that will help reduce transpiration. And the nutrients in the soils are incredibly large in the litter layer, and that gets decomposed into the soil. So the soils are quite fertile and quite rich. And then lastly, we've got the tundra regions. Now those are the regions you'd find in the northern part of the world, and the very southern part, which is on this map. they tend to be very, very cold. So temperatures are basically below 0 degrees most of the year round. They can get up to sort of 10 degrees in summer, but not always. They have very little rainfall, very much like deserts, and that's why sometimes they're called cold deserts. Less than 250 millimeters, and again, it's largely because air is sinking at these areas. So the sort of plants that can survive these conditions are mosses and lichens and very, very sort of small stunted trees of the hardiest sort of variety. And mostly that's because it's really hard to take root because there's a permafrost, and that means the soil is permanently frozen. Nutrients are very slowly released, so any of the trees that grow, they can be very, very small trees of a few feet, and have been growing there for years and years and years because the nutrients are so slowly released only in a very short summer period, and very little sunlight as well. So that summarises really all the sort of 7 major world biomes with regards to their temperatures, the type of vegetation you'd find there, and their soil type. It's very likely you'll get a question, or a small low stakes question about some of these, so just be aware of where you might find them and the kind of countries that you'd expect to find these kind of biomes in globally. Okay. So another thing that we've got to cover with regards to biomes is the reason why they are located where they are located and the reason for their characteristics. So this ties in quite nicely with the other topics from paper 1, specifically the weather hazards and climate change topic. So looking at climate factors, these are global reasons why you'd find the tundra where you find the tundra and the rainforest where you find the rainforest. And again, think back to the weather hazards and climate change topic. Temperature is one factor. So the further north or south you go on the Earth away from the equator, the lower the temperatures get. So temperatures are lower at higher latitudes. Boreal forests, which are nearer the North Pole, are far, far colder than tropical rainforests, for example. It also means that the growing seasons are shorter if you are further north or south. So the longer, warmer climates nearer the equator have very much more vegetation because they've got more sunlight and they've got better conditions to grow that. So that's one of the reasons that you'd find the rainforests where you find the rainforests and the tundra where you find the tundra. The second climate factor is precipitation. So again, this is why climate's important. Now this ties back into global circulation cells. So Hadley cells, which rise at the equator, creating all that rainfall as the air rises, and feral cell boundaries as well. And then you've got your sinking air at the poles, which create a very dry conditions, and you've got the sinking air around sort of 30 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator where you find your deserts. And then lastly, the amount of sunshine. I already mentioned that within the temperature section, but the amount of hours of sunlight. So this relates to things like summer and winter, but you've got lower sunshine hours the more extreme areas, so the north and south of the world. And that lower sunshine hours, and sometimes, for example, 40 to 60 days of the year, sometimes the sun doesn't even rise or set at certain times of year. So as a result of those reduced sunshine hours, it means that you're not going to have as much sunlight for plants to photosynthesize. Whereas in the rainforests, they get sunlight very consistently every single day, and that helps those plants have a stable environment. So the local factors which can affect their sort of characteristics, these tend to be more to do with soils, the rock type, so the geology, and again this ties in with the first topic from this particular paper. So if the rock type, for example, is a particularly a hardy sedimentary rock, then that will determine the kind of nutrients or the mineral composition of the soils that go into it. So different rock and soil types mean that ecosystems can actually be found very similar places but be very different locally. So for example, if you took the rainforest, if one patch of rainforest was above sandstone and another patch of rainforest was above limestone, you would find very, very different types of soil because soil is mainly composed of the rock that's underneath it. The other thing that affects the soil obviously is the vegetation that goes into it from above, but those two factors really, the rock type which affects the soil type, mean that you can have different types of environment even if it's in the same biome. Sandy soils, for example, in the north of Australia means you get tropical savanna grasslands, but they are different savanna grasslands than you'd find in Africa, which has a different soil type. And then lastly, another local factor is how high or low you are to sea level, so altitude. So some plants, for example, can grow very, very well at higher altitudes, but generally speaking, not so many. So if you've got a very mountainous area, you'll tend to find that you have fewer species. So at lower altitudes, it's the opposite. You've got generally kind of favourable conditions for lots of plant life. That's why you'll find that tropical rainforests or mangroves, which are very productive, they'll tend to grow at lower altitudes. Tropical rainforests grow at lower altitudes. Mangroves, however, grow at higher altitudes, and cloud forests, you might find them, for example, at sort of 1200 meters. But again, altitude, rock and soil type, these can change local characteristics, whereas where you find them mainly globally are to do with climate factors. Okay, so you need to be aware of these climate factors and these local factors. So now moving on, looking at something called the biosphere. Now the biosphere, don't be fooled by thinking it's a big circle. The biosphere just means all living things, bio, on Earth. So the biosphere is every living thing, whether it's in the sea, whether it's in the sky, whether it's in the trees, whether it's in the plants, the animals, every living thing on Earth. We're looking at the resources we get from those living things. So biosphere resources can include things like foods. All right, so we obviously eat fish, we eat meat. They are living things. They provide us with a resource. They're a biosphere resource. Fruits and nuts, again, we also eat those, and natural plants, things like crops, wheat and rice, that we've found and then we've cultivated and grown because we use it quite a lot for lots of our staple kind of ingredients. So food is one way that the living kind of parts of the earth, the biosphere, can provide us with a resource. Another way is fuel. So animal dung can be dried and burned, and they used to do that back in the old days, believe it or not, before I was born, obviously. Trees and shrubs obviously can provide fuel as well in terms of biofuel, and if you ferment sugarcane, it can make bioethanol. Other areas that the biosphere helps us is through medicine. So a lot of the rainforests provide us with lots of medicines that we use still today. But even more simply than that, poppies or the opium poppies have morphine, which helps treat pain. Back in Sherlock Holmes days, they used to get quite addicted to that. Aloe vera, it soothes skin conditions, and again we still use that in lots of products that are used for skin today. Something called the rosy periwinkle is a plant that you'd find in the rainforest, which actually helps treat leukemia, which is a sort of brain cancer. And even just something as simple as vitamin C from oranges is really, really good for us as humans in terms of medicine. And then lastly, building materials. So other ways that the living system or living sphere provides us with things is through timber, so trees, animal dung. Again, good old animal dung, rather than being used for fuel, we mix it with clay and straw to make bricks for houses. Again, we don't do that so much now, but that was very much something we used to do in back in the day. And things like straw for roofing and insulation. And if you go to parts of the Broads, they use things like reeds for their thatched roofs as well. Okay, so these are all ways that the biosphere can provide us with lots of resources. Okay, now because the biosphere provides us lots of resources, we use it a lot, and we exploit these resources. And often this word exploitation is not really associated with being a good thing, and that's because we tend to over-exploit these resources. So if you look at the image on the right here, this shows you an area which has been ravaged by us exploiting the natural resources that lie underneath the vegetation. So all these brown patches here are all areas that have been deforested in order for us to access the resources below. So one of the ways that we exploit the biosphere is through increased demand for food from water. So agriculture uses lots of water in order to grow food, industry for making energy, and obviously all the living things that live in water are affected by how much there is or isn't available to us. So we exploit the water in the biosphere due to increased demand for food. Agriculture uses it to grow more food, and industry uses it for energy. And the wealthier we get, the more we have, the more stuff we have that needs energy, the more food we want to buy, and therefore the more water we take out of the hydrosphere, which then links to all the living things that rely on that water. So, for example, plants and animals, they need water just like we do, but we tend to be the greediest one of all. Energy. So energy is another thing, or another consequence really, of us exploiting the biosphere. So biofuels mean that we've got, again, less space for growing crops for food or for natural vegetation, but again our thirst for energy is all consuming and all quenching, and we need more energy, as much energy as we can provide really, for our kind of growing wealth and all our stuff and our gadgets. And then lastly, we also mine, and this is not a biosphere resource, minerals, but because the minerals tend to be underneath things like rainforests, we get rid of those areas in order to get the minerals. Now, one of the most valuable minerals to us as humans is oil, and oil is a former living thing, but the Athabasca oil sands in Canada are deforesting massive areas of boreal forest, and that's what you can see here. This is the Athabasca tar sands, or sorry, oil sands of Canada, where we've stripped away the trees and we've put these big kind of lakes and pools in for purifying it and all sorts of stuff, and it just leaves this big scar on the landscape and destroys all these animals' habitats. So now going more locally, so let's look at the UK's ecosystems, because the first section now we've looked at world ecosystems, world biomes, and how we exploit them for the resources they provide us. Now closer to home, we've kind of got four main ecosystems. We've got lots more than that, to be honest with you, but these four main ecosystems that the exam board highlight in the book. One is heathland, and with regards to heathland, we've got quite a lot actually in England and Wales, mainly in lowland areas. There's a bit of heathland in the west of Norfolk, for example, and they tend to be dry or sandy. They can be marshy, but the soils tend to be quite acidic. You'd kind of find heather, because it's quite hardy, and gorse, that very spiky plant with the yellow flowers, found there. Animals that live there, species that live there, are things like the nightjar and the smooth snake, which is a very rare snake in England. And one example of location that's near to you is Breckland in Norfolk, so think sort of Thetford Forest area. So heathland is one UK ecosystem. We've got quite a few woodlands in the UK as well, but not all of them are natural. So there's very little remaining woodland in the UK compared to what it was. Imagine a time when the UK was about 80 to 90% woodland. This was a sort of just the scene about 300 or 400 years ago. We tended to get rid of quite a lot of that. Oak is one classic example of a deciduous tree, but if you go to Scotland, they naturally had things like Scots pine growing. Example animals, red deer, nightingale, any species really. If you've ever been for a walk in the woods and seen these, they are good examples to use. And one example we use, and I've highlighted this one because it's our case study later, is the New Forest, which is in the south of England. Now, wetland areas, we're really fortunate. We live near the Norfolk Broads, so again we've got another nice example we can just use easily. And they are freshwater lakes and wetlands that are mainly found in Scotland, but also East Anglia. Waterlogged soils, very low in nutrients, and you'll get species like common reed or yellow flag iris. They're both sort of types of plant there. Animals wise, herons and otter, again things we associate with Norfolk quite strongly there. And then lastly, moorland. Now the difference between heathland and moorland is altitude. So we've got quite a lot of moorland in England and Wales. Most of it though you'd find in Scotland. So it's in upland areas. The soils are quite peaty, boggy. There tends to be sort of rough grassland, and again, just like in heathland, which is lowland areas, you'll find heather and gorse growing there. Sort of species you'd find there are red grouse, and there's an example in England of Exmoor, which is down in the southwest of England, but like I said, most of it you'll find in the sort of highlands of Scotland. Now, one thing that's worthwhile mentioning at this point is that there seems to be quite regular describe the distribution question for this in the exam so far. So expect maybe a map that shows potentially these areas, and you maybe could describe the distribution of where you might find heathland, or looking at the map, where is the heathland, where's the woodland, where's the wetland, etc. So another main ecosystem which we're going to look at separately really, and mainly because we kind of degrade it unfortunately, is the marine ecosystems. We are an island, we are surrounded by sea, and because we're surrounded by sea we exploit that resource because it's very, very useful to us. Now there are three ways in which the marine environments or marine ecosystems are important to us in the UK. One is through tourism. Tourism generates loads and loads of money for us in the UK, and as fishing has declined, tourism's kind of taking over. We also use it very much for offshore wind farms, so energy, but in our North Sea deposits, not only is there the potential for wind energy, but we've got our oil and gas fields out in the North Sea, so it's an incredibly important energy resource for us. And finally, there is still fishing going on. It's not as much as it used to be, but our fishing grounds are incredibly important to a lot of people in this country. So why is tourism so important? Let's just give you some specifics. About 250 million people are estimated to visit the UK coasts every single year. Doesn't mean they're necessarily swimming in the sea, but they do like to be beside the seaside. Now that provides lots of jobs and money for the locals, which is invaluable to us really. With regards to energy, the London Array, which you'll talk a bit more about in topic 3 of paper 2, which is the world's largest wind farm, although that will change all the time. It's a pretty big wind farm though, that said, and it's vital to UK future energy security because wind is a sustainable energy source, and as I mentioned, we get oil and gas from the North Sea as well. And then lastly, fishing. Yes, there's not as many as there were, but still quite a few jobs in fishing. Important enough jobs to be still an important, a significant factor. But also we export a lot of our fish to other countries. Mackerel. We don't eat so much of it in this country, but the rest of Europe really lap it up. They love a bit of mackerel. So, degradation. Now these don't necessarily match up, but we are degrading our marine ecosystems in a few ways. Largely through development, use of fertilizers, and from overfishing. So development, because tourism is worth so much money, a lot of places cotton onto that and start to develop hotels and develop buildings. So as a result of that, those coastlines, they can actually damage any ecosystems that live there, any species that live there, and too much tourism, yes, it's good for money, but it's not so good for environments like salt marshes, like you'd find in Blakeney, for example. Fertilizers. Now, our farmers obviously try and make our land nice and productive. They use fertilizers to help grow and increase their crop yields. But those fertilizers, if they get washed into the rivers, they can make their way to the sea, and that can cause this thing called eutrophication. Okay, so it's a funny old word there. Eutrophication, it really is just allowing plants that use, obviously, fertilizers make plants grow really well. Plants in the seas and rivers, if they've got more fertilizers, they'll grow too well, and they can starve the marine sort of species below the plant life from sunlight and oxygen, etc. So eutrophication is not a good thing, and that's because, like I say, fertilizers getting washed off the fields when it rains into the rivers, into the sea. And then lastly, another way we're degrading or making worse our marine ecosystems is from overfishing. And again, we'll look at overfishing in a bit more detail in another topic when it comes to resources, which again, topic 3, paper 2. So species like cod are the main example really. They've been overfished for years and years and years, and they've declined massively compared to where they were. And that means that obviously there's less food in the food chain, but also it impacts jobs and the economy, so there's negatives all round for overfishing. We are getting a bit of a handle on it, but it's still one of those topics that is a bit sensitive, and it's something which can change at any point. Okay, and again, with any of these things, any importance of ecosystems or degradation, be prepared to develop the knock-on effects of these, and I've tried to give you as many knock-on effects as I can in this slide. Okay, something worth mentioning as well, Gersmehl models. Now, Gersmehl models are something which they may appear, I'm not 100% sure whether they will, but they appear in the specification, so it's worth talking about. Gersmehl models show nutrients, and nutrients are mainly stored in 3 areas. Any ecosystem has biomass, that means the living materials, all plants, all animals. Litter, which basically are the old living bits, so dead plants, dead animals, or bits of leaf, for example. This is called leaf litter. And then lastly, the soils. So nutrients are stored in the soil, in the living materials, and in the litter. And the proportions of these can change. Now, they also get passed between these different stores through various means. So when plants and animals die, or bits fall off them, then their tissues become litter. At this point, they'd be sitting around forever. But what happens is our friends the decomposers step in and they turn the nutrients from the litter into something that can be absorbed by the soil. So the biomass dies and the plants die and animals die. That then becomes litter, and then that process, or that sort of nutrient store, gets decomposed to go into the soil, and then the nutrients that are in the soil, they get taken up by the living material, so the biomass. And so plants uptake nutrients through the soil, which they then pass along the food chain to animals that eat them, so the herbivores. So you can see there is a cycle. That's why they're called Gersmehl models or Gersmehl cycles, nutrient cycles, that the nutrients are just recycled all the way around. Now, at different ecosystems, they're recycled at different rates, but it's not just a closed system. There's other bits and bobs that we need to be aware of as well. So for example, you can actually get more nutrients into the litter from dissolved kind of minerals in rainfall. So as rainfall falls into the litter, it adds nutrients into the litter store. And you can also get nutrients going into the rock, and that's because, yes, this little brown bit you see at the top of the soil, that's very nutrient rich. The darker colour tends to suggest it's decomposed material. But you go further down the soil, you can see it starts to get lighter. That doesn't mean these are devoid of nutrients, but underneath the soil is rock, the bedrock. And as that weathers chemically, it adds nutrients into the soil from below. So the soil is kind of a combination of the nutrients from below and also the nutrients that are coming in from the litter decomposing in the top. But as well as these adding nutrients, we can also get nutrients washed out of the system. So sometimes if it rains too much, these leaves or any dead material or any nutrients in the litter can actually run off. They can get lost through too much water. And the same can happen with the soil. If the soil is too wet, some of the moisture will take away some of the nutrients and then take them down the river to the sea. So you've got inputs and outputs, okay, coming out of litter and the soil. The biomass tends to be the one where there's very few inputs and outputs. So they can be simplified, okay, to BLS, biomass, litter, soil. P means precipitation. RO means runoff. W means weathering, and L means leaching. So this is how sometimes you can see Gersmehl models abbreviated. Don't be scared by that. That's just like the shortening of these terms. So you've got the full version here. The other thing about these are they're quite useful because the size of the store can change depending on the type of ecosystem. So I'll go back to this in a second. If, for example, you have most of your material, most of your nutrients in your biomass because you've got lots of plants and animals, then this circle would be bigger. And if there's not much in the way of litter or soil nutrients, then these circles would be a bit smaller. And the arrows can change as well in terms of their thickness. The fatter the arrow, the more that thing is happening. So if there was a big fat arrow here, and this was much bigger than these other ones, for example, it would show you that lots of the nutrients are being passed from the soil to the biomass, and vice versa. So now we've seen Gersmehl models, we'll see them in action really, looking at rainforests. So this is it. This is looking at our first major biome or major ecosystem, and you'll look at two. With regards to tropical rainforests, you'll need to see what features they have, the biodiversity, so the variety of living materials, and adaptations of that biodiversity. So this slide really is a summary of all the kind of stuff you need to know about tropical rainforests. So you can see a few images. I'll talk to you about those as we go along. So where they're found, we know this from the first slide of this PowerPoint. They're found mainly around the equator, for example, the Amazon rainforest and the Congo rainforest in Africa. They have living biotic components, which include plants, animals, humans. That's true of any ecosystem. And they contain non-living abiotic components like climate, soil, water. Again, also true of any ecosystem. They've got very few nutrients in the soil, and that's because they are tropical rainforests. Now, if we go back to the Gersmehl model, and there's one, this is a specific rainforest one down here, in the soil, this little S, you can see it's quite a small circle, and it's quite a small circle because it's a small store of nutrients. The reason it's a small store, because it rains so bloomin' much, loads of the nutrients actually come out through leaching from the soil. It also gets quite a bit because of weathering, because again weathering occurs more with more rain, but a lot of the nutrients get washed away in leaching and washed away in runoff from the litter too. Chemical weathering is common because it's warm and moist. Again, that explains why you've got this extra W weathering going into the soil. But again, the soil is a small store. They are inhabited, or people, indigenous tribes live in there. They, in the rainforest, the most remote areas. They still hunt and carry out their small-scale agriculture and survive in those areas, but they are dwindling. It is the most productive ecosystem on Earth. What that means is it's got the most variety of plants and animals anywhere. It's got a very complex layered structure. You can see this structure here to the right. So the very tallest trees with the maximum sunlight are the emergents. They emerge from the canopy. The next most amount of sunlight available and the thickest layer is the canopy layer. And this is where you'll find most of your vegetation and most of your biodiversity. All the species of plants and animals tend to live up here as well. Underneath that, you can get some sort of smaller shrubs and trees which get sort of half the light, and then down in the shrub layer is where you get very little light because it's all being blocked out, by the canopy and the under canopy. And they've got a hot, wet, year-round climate. So you can see, look, this is the precipitation and temperature. This is a climate graph for the tropical rainforest, where the rainfall is pretty much high all year round, and the temperature very consistent. That's why this line is very flat. So this Gersmehl model shows you where all the nutrients are stored in the biomass, and how very few are stored in the litter and the soil. So in terms of adaptations, animals, how they're adapted. Monkeys have got long tails, strong gripping hands to reach the highest level of the canopy because that's where their food is going to be, that most productive area. The Europlatus gecko is a good example of a camouflage species, but if you've got other species that you know are camouflaged in the rainforest, then just use those. And tree frogs, what they do is they'll lay their eggs in little patches of water in things like branch trunk joints. So where you've got a branch coming out from a tree, it'll store a bit of water like a little pond almost, and tree frogs will lay their little eggs in there. In terms of adaptations and plant adaptations, emergent trees, these really tall ones here at the top, they have very few branches, and what they do tend to have is these buttress roots, which you can see. Now they are like stabilizers. They help a really tall tree, 40-50 meters high, support itself without having branches there as well. So the reason it doesn't have many branches is because if they did have branches, it would get stuck trying to get through the canopy. So it's important to be as sort of narrow as they possibly can be, so to get that sunlight. The leaves of the plants have quite a waxy coating often to avoid moisture, and drip tips mean that leaves don't rot because they get too much surface water. Roots tend to be quite shallow, but that's because most of the nutrients are near the surface. If the roots went deeper, by the time the other plants have had their share of the nutrients, they'd be left without anything. So it doesn't make any sense really for the plants to have deep root systems. Okay, so goods and services found in the rainforest and the effects of climate change. So what you'll find in the rainforest are certain things that we use, that we can touch, tangible items, and specifically those are in the green here. So fruits and nuts, a lot of the indigenous tribes will use those for food, but they can be sold as well. Timber for construction, furniture, fuel, and a range of plant species that develop medicines. So I mentioned the rosy periwinkle from the Biosphere earlier. The blue shows services that the rainforest provides, and they are also known as the lungs of the planet. So they actually can take up to 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere every single year. So it makes sense that these trees are going to be a good way to tackle climate change in future. Tourism provides lots of opportunities for people and education. It's not necessarily something you can touch from the rainforest, but is a way to provide a service to people, seeing the beautiful world of the rainforests. And it's also indigenous tribes, people's homes. So it is a place where people live. But rainforests are absolutely under threat, and climate change is one of the biggest threats to them. So we've looked at the episode on climate change from the second topic of this paper, and you can see that climate change, in terms of us getting maybe drier, warmer conditions, mean that actually the biomass structure and the structure of rainforests might actually start to have, like say, longer, drier periods, and that will slow down how quickly trees and any litter rots and decomposes. So if that happens, it reduces the amount of nutrients in the soil, which means that there's less for the living stuff that is currently there, and those plants will absolutely struggle to survive because there's fewer nutrients to go around. So it can really affect the structure of a rainforest in terms of the Gersmehl model. Function, what the rainforest does, again, if you've got drier spells because of climate change, it can stop what's called cloud functioning of rainforests. So rainforests provide lots of moisture into the atmosphere, which helps feed them constantly with their moisture. So if you can if you stop them being as wet, then those plants won't be able to increase the amount of rainfall through transpiration, and there'll be less regular rainfall, which can have knock-on effects to the plants themselves. So that can be a horrible effect of climate change on the tropical rainforests. And then lastly, the knock-on effects of those are obvious, really. Biodiversity, the range of plants and animals will be less if there are fewer plants and there are fewer animals. So because it's drier, some of those plants might they're not adapted to living in conditions where it's drier. Rainforests are meant to be wet all year round. If they dry for any period of time, the plants are not used to that, and so they will die. And if they die, then the knock-on effects to those species might be worse. Also, it can change the conditions of the rainforest. You allow other species to move in and invade and take over, and that's not something you want as well, because that means it reduces variety as well. So we're deforesting the rainforest as well, and this is not a good thing. So one of the threats is obviously climate change, which you've seen here. Another threat is us. So the reasons we are deforesting the rainforest. Firstly, the main reason, the overarching reason, is rapid population growth. There are more of us than there've ever been, and all of us need houses, we need food, and the demand for housing and agriculture means that places like Madagascar, for example, where the population's gone up from 4 million in 1950 to 20.7 million in 2010, so it's a huge increase in just 60 years, mean that all of that extra pressure on the land means that deforestation is more likely to occur. So other ways, or more specific reasons we deforest, we build roads. You can see that road building, you've got to clear the area for the roads to be built in the first place, but road building tends to then lead to more little roads and more deforestation alongside those as well. But we build roads, and we also then extract things like iron ore and timber from the rainforest. And the Trans-Amazonia Highway is a really good example, you can see here, of a road that goes through a rainforest and leads to further deforestation, because it makes it easier to access the resources. So mining is one of those other resources. Lots of valuable minerals. For example, iron ore is an incredibly valuable mineral, and the Caracas iron ore mine in Brazil is one such example where the forests are cleared to get at the iron ore underneath. And lastly, logging, the very basics of just needing wood. So we've got a huge demand for timber in the West. So by the West we mean the wealthy West, so USA and Europe. And because there's a huge demand for timber, Brazil will strip the land, sell that wood to places, for example, like China, where they manufacture it into furniture, and then we will buy it. So logging is one of those ones one of those reasons that we are directly deforesting the tropical rainforest. The second kind of major reason is through agriculture. Again, we've talked about the need to grow more food for the rising populations. Palm oil is a product that's used in so many products. It's a key ingredient in lots and lots of things, for cosmetics, not just food, for cosmetics, as a biofuel, etc. So palm oil plantations are potentially very profitable, and therefore, get rid of the trees, plant the palms, and then let's sell it on. Cattle ranching is another one. Beef. The world want burgers, and so because we want beef, we need land to rear the species. And beef cattle don't like grazing through woodland. They like grass, and so you clear the woodland to create grassland. And again, that reduces the amount of woodland that's there. And then lastly, even just small-scale subsistence agriculture. What we mean is agriculture that you don't sell. This is just for you to live on. So the indigenous tribes, for example, will clear areas of land using what's called slash and burn. They'll chop it down with a machete, and then they'll set it alight, and then they'll use that patch to grow crops. So these are all ways in which that we are causing deforestation in the rainforest. So we need to manage it, and looking at the Amazon specifically as a case study of how we manage the tropical rainforest. So we've used the case study which is in any of the revision guides, so there's a good summary of it here, like I said. So one of the ways that we can manage the rainforest is by community programs, and I've got some specific examples for you here. So in Natutama in Colombia, there's a community scheme that educates the locals in protecting species. So it helps the locals who would be deforesting areas or using the rainforest a certain way to try and preserve important species like the river dolphin. And also they use local fishermen. Fishermen are used to help collect information about species, report any illegal loggers, because they use the waterways, they use the Amazon River. And the Amazon River passes through miles and miles and miles of rainforest. So if they see people logging, they can report it to the authorities and make sure that that sort of thing gets shut down, that kind of activity gets shut down. Another way is sustainable forestry, and we do this quite regularly in this country as well. You do something called selective logging. You don't just chop down all of the trees for the ones you want, you chop down the ones you want. And a company called Precious Woods Amazon, or a group, sorry, called Precious Woods Amazon, they try and make sure that there's no single overexploited tree species in the Amazon. And the Forest Stewardship Council, or the FSC, you might have seen their logo on products like toilet paper. They help by only using sustainably sourced wood for their products. Biosphere reserves. The main thing here is that biosphere, again, the living areas, reserves it's like a national park essentially. It's where you cordon off big areas of rainforest to try and protect them. The best well-known example is the Central Amazon Conservation Complex, or the CAC, which protects over 60,000 square kilometres of rainforest. So people live there and can go there, but it restricts their hunting and fishing and logging, and it helps fund scientific research, which they can use for things like medicines in future. So community programs, sustainable forestry, biosphere reserves, and the last one is ecotourism, one of the big ones that people seem to remember well. So rather than use the rainforest to make money by chopping it down, you can use the rainforest to make money by getting people to come and pay to come and see it. But they don't just pay to come and see it. They pay you to work for you, which is a bit of a strange situation. But people like the experience of it. It's like be a zookeeper for the day. So in the Yacana Lodge in Ecuador, they use locals as guides, and they charge tourist entrance fees to fund conservation and education programs. And sometimes they just get the tourists to come in and build fences and help feed orphaned orangutans and things like that. So there's all sorts of ways that you can manage the rainforest, still make money from it, but hopefully not completely destroy it altogether. So that summarises rainforests. Now the last part of this topic is to look at deciduous woodlands. So as with the structure of rainforests, deciduous woodlands, we look at the features and adaptations. Again, you can see another Gersmehl model here, which shows you the difference between this one and the tropical rainforest one if you go back a few slides. So we find them mainly in Europe, Southeast USA, China and Japan. Again, just like the rainforest, it's got biotic and abiotic components. The soil is very different though. It's very deep. It's very fertile. There's lots of leaf litter. You can see the litter store is much higher, and that then goes into the soil and decomposes into the soil nicely every single year. It leaches less than the rainforests because there's a bit less rainfall, so nutrients have got a bit more time to move through the soil and get a bit deeper. They're very productive, not quite as productive as rainforests, but there's still most of the nutrients are stored in the living biomass material. The reason they're less productive than rainforest is because they have winter season, and it's harder to grow in the winter because there's less light and the soil can often be frozen. They've also got a layered structure, very similar to the rainforest, where you've got your canopy layer, you've got your sub-canopy and your herb or ground layer, but not really emergent trees. And the climate is more temperate, so you can see here that it's got rainfall most of the year, but nowhere near the same amount of rainfall as you found in rainforests. But it's also got a seasonal temperature climate, so hotter in the summer and colder in the winter months. So adaptations, animals are adapted. Things like birds migrate in the winter, which they wouldn't have to do if they're in the rainforest. Squirrels store their food by burying it in the spring and summer, and things like hedgehogs hibernate in winter as well. In terms of plant adaptations, trees will drop their leaves so they don't lose water during the winter time, and they can't access it if there is there because if it's frozen in the ground. Branches, rather than being narrow trees trying to compete for space, branches for trees in the deciduous forests can be a bit wider, so that you tend to kind of have a slightly thinned out woodland. And to try and get as much sunlight as possible, you can see this tree here has got a nice, it's losing its leaves obviously for the winter, you can see them underneath, but it would spread out quite far compared to maybe a rainforest tree because there's a bit more space around it. And roots can go deeper. So again, rather than having shallow root systems which create buttress roots and things like that, it can actually have deeper root systems because a lot more of the nutrients can go underground and be accessed that way. So again, just like tropical rainforests, we're going to look at the goods and services for deciduous woodlands. The goods include things like mushrooms. One of my favourite products. I love a mushroom, especially studying it like a proper geek that I am. But non-timber forest products like mushrooms, for example, grow in deciduous woodlands. And a good product to use. Timber for construction, about 13 million tonnes of timber is taken from deciduous woodlands in the UK each year, and we use things like wood pellets. We use them for biomass power stations, which is technically a sustainable source of energy. Services, similar to the rainforest but not quite as much. The UK woodlands can actually take up to 1 million tonnes of CO2 every year. Nowhere near the same amount as a rainforest, but still quite a hefty chunk. Lots of rare plant and animal species live in the deciduous woodlands, and those species are nice. They're nice to look at, they're nice to study, particularly things like the red squirrel. And things like tourism and recreation opportunities. So people like to go cycling in woodlands, go hiking, go sort of trampling through, and using it for just for enjoyment, really. So, climate change and how climate change is affecting the deciduous woodlands. Similar to the rainforest, it's going to get drier, it's going to get hotter. So, in terms of the increasing temperatures and the dry conditions, it means that we're more likely to get things like forest fires. And forest fires don't tend to happen in this country, but if they did, it could cause all sorts of problems. If there's long periods of drought, because it's getting drier, it means some trees will not be able to survive, and therefore, if they can't survive, their ability to store carbon is zero. But also, if they have less drought conditions, they're trying to shut off their systems to just survive, and therefore storing carbon is not as easy for them as well from the atmosphere. So the function in terms of taking up this tons of carbon every year will reduce and make them less effective. And also, biodiversity could cause all sorts of problems, because if it does get warmer in winter, pests could survive longer. Diseases like ash dieback can just completely destroy our species, and Dutch elm disease as well, and affect all sorts of tree species, which again have a knock-on effect further along the food chain. So climate change, again, bad news for deciduous woodlands. And we are deforesting these areas a bit too much too. So again, population growth, always the underlying factor there. High car ownership, we've got to expand urban areas, we've got need new homes, means that maybe deciduous forest areas are kind of earmarked for felling, so we can actually build homes in those areas. So rather than resource extraction in this country, we don't really go underneath our woodlands for things like gold and diamonds and minerals, and we tend to just prefer timber. So we replant with conifer trees. Now that's not a good thing. 38% of woodland was cleared in the 20th century, and rather than replace the oak and the ash and the elm and the beech trees, the native species, we just planted very fast growing conifer trees. Thetford Forest is an example of a very wide sort of scale plantation project, one of the largest in Europe, where we grow fast growing conifer trees like this, so we can chop them down every year and use them for fuel and for other products. But not only are conifers fast growing, you can put more of them together in a space because they have fewer branches. You can see these are very long, thin trees, and because they're long, thin, and they grow fast, we can get loads of wood in a small space, so you get a quick return on your investment. And then lastly, because of these reasons for growing conifers, the knock-on effects might be that actually you reduce the light. Because they're so packed together, the forest floor has got very little light coming through to it. Naturally, in the deciduous forests, when the trees die back, other plants like bluebells can start to exploit early spring before the trees have got their leaves on again. And so if you have conifers which keep their pines all year round because they're evergreen, then you reduce the amount of plants that can live on the forest floor like bluebells. And you don't want to do that because bluebells are lovely. And then lastly, agriculturally speaking. So in this country, we don't tend to clear forests nowadays for agriculture, but we still use pesticides. And pesticides are things that destroy any bugs or pests that grow near our crops. So because woods often border farmland, the pesticides spray into the woods a little bit, and because of that, it means that the edge of the woodland can be negatively affected. It can create sort of a poorer quality habitat on the edge, and that erodes into the already small habitat of woodland left. But also, currently we're okay farmland wise. There's not much in the way of farmland being created by deforesting in this country, but if the population does grow, there may need to be more need for food, and also if we need to rely on our own food supply, it might mean that we are deforesting areas to grow more for the population. So the need for farmland is always one of those concerns that we have to just keep an eye on. Okay, so the very final part of this is looking at the management of deciduous woodland, and specifically we look at the New Forest, which is just near, you can see Bournemouth and Southampton, just between the two, and it's a very large area of deciduous forest with Lyndhurst in the middle of it, and several sort of settlements in there, but it's a very well known example, and again it's in the revision guide, so you've got lots of ways and lots of information about it. So the New Forest National Park in South England is a popular tourist attraction, about 15 million visitors a year, one of the most visited national parks in the country. But when you visit and people visit, people are not as respectful maybe, as particularly people that don't live there. So litter gets dropped even if it's by accident, air pollution because of cars, footpath erosion which tramples species and is not great. They extract soft and hardwoods for timber as well in the New Forest, and about 40% of it is privately owned. Now privately owned is fine because it means it's protected, but it also means that it's not properly managed, and we need to manage woodland to keep it healthy and to keep the species kind of growing well, and also to try and stop species invading that escape from gardens, like rhododendron for example, which absolutely decimates forest floor plants because it just absorbs all the sunlight. Rhododendron is a pest, it's an alien species, it shouldn't be there, but if you don't manage the area it can take over very quickly. So how do we manage the New Forest? Sorry about that bell in the background. How do we manage the New Forest? Well, a few ways. Firstly, it's got legal protections in this country. The New Forest is a national park, which means you cannot do certain things there. It's very restrictive. It's also got within it several sites of special scientific interest, or SSSIs, and national nature reserves as well. So there's lots of legal protection around that with all the sites that occur in the New Forest. Also, they've introduced a replanting scheme where rather than replacing deciduous trees with conifer trees, they actually replace deciduous trees with deciduous trees, which is the way it should be. They are slower growing, but also they are more native species, so it's important that we do that. They also allow certain places to become honeypot sites. Now what that means is, and let's take an example, let's say, I'm not sure if this is the case, but let's say Lyndhurst was a really popular honeypot site, a place where there's lots of car parks, there's still nice woodland there and some wild horses, etc. But if you attract most people to go to this area, it means that places maybe like Bramshaw and Burley and Sway and Brockenhurst and Beaulieu, or wherever that is, they are more protected because everyone's flocking to this place because it's easy to park, there's a McDonald's near there, or whatever it might be. So a honeypot site means that you maybe sacrifice this area a little bit and it's a bit damaged to help protect all these other areas around it. But often that can mean that this area becomes under too much pressure, which isn't always the best thing, and the locals not so keen on that. If I used a Norfolk Broads case study example, think Wroxham. You go to Wroxham, go to Roy's, you've got all the shops there, big staid boatyard, there's a McDonald's there, and that helps protect places like Ramworth, which they're more of a nature reserve feel to them, very quiet, very little traffic, small little car park, to discourage as many people from going there. In terms of tree management specifically, they can use pollarding. Now pollarding is where you essentially chop back the branches and then they'll keep shooting new branches because a lot of the trees are very resilient. And that's great because what it does is it provides nesting sites for birds, but it also keeps any new shoots away from deer because deer are a real pest in this country. Deer could do with being shot a few more times and eaten by us. If you see venison in the butchers, go and buy it because there's more market for it. It means they'll shoot more deer. Deer kill our trees. There's no natural predator in the UK for deer, so they pollard to try and stop the deer nibbling at the kind of the new shoots because they're far too high for the deer to reach. But unfortunately, pollarding is a bit weird looking. It makes the tree look a bit ugly. They provide dedicated walking and cycling routes in certain areas, but again, people like to wander through the woods where they like to wander, so that can often be ignored. Coppicing, it's a bit like pollarding, but right at the base of a tree. So if you coppice areas, it allows shoots to come from the roots and encourages new growth. Leaflets can be given to people that go there, and they can be picked up in car parks, and there's information boards, etc., to help people act responsibly in areas. So there's a leaflet known as 5 Ways to Love the Forest, and this is a good way to educate young children about the importance of looking after the new forest. There is less work in terms of foresting work in April to August, which is when nesting birds are present, so they don't get disturbed by any of the logging activity. And then lastly, they charge you for parking. So it puts you off because it's blooming expensive, but it also means that it raises money for conservation. But the negative of that is that some families, maybe on lower incomes, are priced out of going to wonderful areas, and it becomes a place for only the rich people, which is really not fair. Okay, so that summarises the ecosystems topic. Again, there's lots there, lots to kind of chew over. Please feel free to go back and look at any other areas you need or ask questions in class at another time. Thanks again for listening.